in different ways. But what we notice is that our country has evolved its own unique way of dealing with COVID-19, and to a larger extent, we have been successful in containing the spread of COVID-19. It is unfortunate that a few thousands have lost their lives because of COVID-19, but the effective measures that we have taken at different levels, because it is multidimensional problem. You have societal issues, you have medical infrastructure issues, you have economic issues, but the way we handled the COVID-19 pandemic, we are very, very confident that sooner or later we will overcome this challenge, and our country will continue to grow at a faster pace and restore the original economic activities and move forward. And there could be no better person than Shri Gurumurthy ji to talk about how the country is dealing with the COVID-19 situation. I once again extend a very warm welcome to Shri Gurumurthy ji. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, now let me request respected Gurumurthy ji to deliver his lecture. All of us are actually eagerly waiting to listen to his views. He has extensively written on this issue, and he is a very good economic, political analyst and all. So, sir, the floor is yours now, and we want to listen to your views on this particular theme.
Thank you, Mr. Mahapatra. Dr. Jagdish Kumar and his colleagues at the JNU, which is one of the most talked about institutions in the country for diverse reasons. And I recollect my visit to JNU maybe a decade ago in connection with the lecture which I delivered. I don't even remember what was the forum, but afterwards I haven't had any opportunity to address the JNU, which has its own critical importance in the life of India. See, this COVID-19 is regarded widely as a phenomenon which is on, the end of which is not in sight anywhere in the world, as something which will change the global order once and for all and ever, which means there will be such a change in which we may be able to find very little traces of continuity. The most important thing in any change is continuity. But this COVID-19 is such a phenomenon, like of which I don't think there is anything, including the First and the Second World War, which were massive disturbances, which has affected the world in the way in which this is. So there is almost a universal opinion, including in a very short article Henry Kissinger has written, that the global order will change forever. This is the word he had used. And no one is able to say what will be the change in that order, what will be the content of the or character of the new order that will emerge. In fact, in an article which Francis Fukuyama had written in the Foreign Affairs magazine, which I read yesterday, that shows the extent of confusion in the world. He says the liberal order may disappear, or it may come back again in a more vibrant form, or there may be a mix of both. I mean, you can understand the extent of confusion by the bandwidth of the changes that are likely. So this has to be very carefully watched by each country, particularly India, which has its own importance and dynamic role in the world in the present circumstances. So it is not clear which is the world order that will emerge, in which we have a significant role to play, both as persons who will be shaping the world order as well as a unit which will be affected by the New World Order. In both, we have a role. But what is the world order from which this new world order is emerging? On that, there has been no discussion, as if it is a given thing. So, I have been trying to, because in the course of my understanding of Indian economy, in the context of the geopolitics, which has begun influencing the Indian economy, as well as the rest of the world economies, I have been studying how the world has emerged and shifted and shaped in the last 3-4 decades. See, the traces of the present world order is to be sourced in the Cold War order. The Cold War order was ideological between the socialist bloc and the free world bloc. And this ideological clash led to the involvement of America in Vietnam, which caused the greatest disturbance to the free world, from which America wanted relief. And that led to a new phenomenon called balance of power theory, sans ideology. This is where the most original contribution came from Henry Kissinger, that ideologies do not matter. We have to take the world as it is. We have to deal with the powers that are there already, and we have to work out appropriate relationship with them to have a balanced world order. And that is how China was approached through the efforts of Pakistan, which played the role of the broker in between America and China. And that is how the balance of power was shifted from the socialist bloc by chipping the socialist bloc into two. With the result, America could, though humiliatingly, escape from Vietnam. It was an escape. With the result, the socialist bloc splintered and weakened. And by the Star Wars program and other pressures exerted by the West, the most efficient economic model, that is, the more efficient economic model than the Marxist model, succeeded, and the socialist order collapsed. The gap between the current world order, which is based on the idea of the West as the best, and it is best for the rest to follow the West. This is the principle of globalization. I will make it good later when I am going to present it. The difference between the Cold War ideological position and this is the breakup of the Cold War, in which the defection of China from the communist bloc to the free world, a completely mismatched alliance emerged. In fact, there are records to show President Nixon warned Kissinger not to overcommit to China. But somehow Kissinger felt that for the West to retain its position over the rest, weakened China is necessary as an ally. That is how China was brought into this overall unlikely alliance. And so this went to the extent of accepting a Marxian polity and a Marxian economics as part of a strategic partner. So China emerged as a strategic partner of America between the Cold War and the post-Cold War world order. When the communist structure collapsed, the post-Cold War order emerged, and no one could have put it more beautifully or at that time more acceptably than Francis Fukuyama, who said that the West, with its free market and democracy, has won finally against the rest, and it is the best for the rest to follow the Western model. This was the basis of globalization. But in which, this is the third stage, Cold War stage, Cold War breakup stage. Now we are going into the post-Cold War stage, in which the current order is based, and in which the most critical component was China, which was accepted into the WTO, which was a free market model, but with its Marxian polity intact. This is where the problem arose, as we will go to examine. The Cold War breakup was accomplished through breaking the ideology, making ideology irrelevant, and post Cold War model was based on the victory of free market and democracy over what they really meant to be the victory of the West over the West is the socialist model, because the entire assessment was economic. So, in purely economic modeling, the efficient capitalist free market model won against the inefficient communist model, because I recollect I had a discussion with Dr. Ashok Mitra in the course of the when globalization was unfolding, and I was trying to emphasize the Swadeshi viewpoint. When we were discussing, he said it is very easy to talk about Swadeshi, it is very difficult to produce people who will be Swadeshis. I told him it is the same thing about communism. It is very easy to talk about communism, but it is very difficult to produce communists. So this is where the inefficient idealization of human life cost the communist structure, because it was impractical, and market was practical, but it was able to consolidate the selfishness of the people for the purpose of development. How sustainable it is, that we will see later. So in the second stage, China became a strategic partner. In the third stage, it became a full-fledged partner through the WTO. I emphasize again because I am going to make a remark as to how it produced a mismatch from which the present situation has come. So the catch here was China, with its Marxian polity, was entering into market economics at the global level. At the global level, a nation is a player. You cannot play a democratic game at the global level, a transparent game at the global level, without being transparent at home. This conflict has nothing to do with ideology. It has to do with the system. In fact, I would take the free market economist Milton Friedman, who said democracy is a precondition for market economy. And I will go to Amartya Sen, who said democracy is necessary for market functioning. There is no difference between the free market thinker or a left thinker on the role of democracy in market. This was what was missed by the West when it co-opted China as a full-fledged partner of the WTO. Why I am mentioning this is that in 2017, the US Trade Representative produced a report that it is impossible to have WTO functioning on a fair basis without China being transparent. How could China be transparent? The same report was submitted by, identical report was submitted by the European Union Trade Representative, who said that if WTO functions on the same basis as a non-transparent China, WTO will become irrelevant. So you see the mismatch between a non-transparent polity operating in a transparent world market. This was never thought of as a problem because it was accepted under the formulation of Kissinger and the necessity to break the Cold War and for the West to continue to have its dominant role. It overlooked what a non-transparent China could do in a transparent world economy. Why this is important is that the rest of the world acquiesced into the Western formulation, and a weaker China, the weaker rest of the world, whether it's Russia or other countries, acquiesced in. And this acquiescence was regarded as development of mutual trust. There was no mutual trust. Everybody thought that globalization has two components. One is, Francis Fukuyama said this is the end of all conflicts because ideologies produce conflicts, ideologies have evaporated because the West has finally won against the rest. The first formulation. Second formulation, the Western worldview model operating system are the best because Western democracy and Western market model have proved to be the most efficient way of handling the world. And in fact, he went to the extent of saying that these two will produce Hegel's perfect society. In fact, this was the extent of euphoria in the West, which made West miscalculate. You know, when you are in great euphoria, you should never decide about the future. When you are in great depression, you should never decide about the future. These two are conditions which you must overcome. You must overcome the effect of euphoria as well as depression to see what will happen in future. So, just as 1990 euphoria produced an unsustainable globalization model, the present depression, the present difficulties, if we don't overcome it and see into the future, this will produce an equally unsustainable model is something which we will have to understand. The euphoric West in the 1990s went ahead and accepted Deng Xiaoping's great formulation. Is one country with the two systems. That is, the mainland China will be autocratic, socialist, one-party model, but Hong Kong will be a free democracy. And for Taiwan also, we will give the same model. On that basis, Kissinger suggested Taiwan to merge into mainland China. You can understand the extent to which a euphoric West to go to assess a situation that two unmixable cocktails can work together. And the world accepted it. It's so unfortunate. So the US accepted this strange idea that there could be one country with the two models. In the same way, the idea of a Marxian polity with market economics as the strange mix was accepted into the WTO, which has become the biggest problem of the world, particularly Western world, to handle. This entire assumption that there will be no conflicts, that the Western approach to the world is the best, was questioned by two critical events. One was the 9/11 attack, which completely shook America. Because America has been enjoying enormous amount of isolation in terms of geography, in terms of military power, in terms of economic power, in terms of the administrative structure they had produced. They would not allow any person whom they do not want into the country. That is the efficient model that they have produced. Into that country, when terror struck, America could never understand how Pakistan and India have an open border, and India has been undergoing this kind of issues month to month, week to week, year to year, and and America was enjoying it. But when it struck America, America could understand what kind of disturbance terrorism could make. This is the first message that was delivered, that the Fukuyama theory that the world will be hereafter free of conflicts has been ruled out as the future. And there is something very greatly wrong in thinking that the world will be completely peaceful. This is one thing. This critical event shook the West into realizing that there cannot be a global model. The West understood it in 2005 G20 meeting. The G20 actually the finance ministers and central bank governors of the G20 nations made an open declaration that there is no one-size-fits-all model for the world. This was the starting point of the idea of globalization. So they openly declared that there is nothing called one-size-fits-all model. Every nation will have to work out its own model. This was announced in 2005, which was as a direct consequence of what happened in 2001, because the world cannot be governed by one idea, one model, one system, one way of life. Then came the second event, the global financial meltdown in 2008. You see, the entire basis of globalization was the US and the transatlantic countries will control the financial system, and everybody will be subordinate to them in the financial order. They will control the global monetary order, they will control money. But the real economy could be handled by anybody. So they made a model in which they will control the financial economics and the real economics could be handled by anybody. That is how they made financial economy, separation between financial economy and real economy. They went completely wrong there. Because a non-transparent China was able to make use of this reckless attitude of the West to ignore real economy, and they took advantage of it and they strengthened the real economy. They produced one of the most powerful manufacturing and real economies in the world, both in terms of physical manufacture as well as production of services. This is what shook America into realizing that this free market model with a Marxian polity operating it will not work. And this became the emergence of Trumpism in America. Trumpism is not because of Trump. Trump was an output of a process which had worked. And when Trump said that the clash is between globalism and patriotism, he had merely said what was an evolving opinion in America, that American interests versus global interest. Globalization as a common global interest has ceased to be an American way of thinking today, and I will later tell you that this is no more a Trump approach. There is a bipartisan consensus on that. Whether it is the USTR report or the bill to withdraw from WTO, which is moved by a Democratic senator. So it is no more an idea that can be associated only with Trump, who is supposed to be a very strange president taking unusual decisions. He may be as a person, but in this, he represents an America which is disowning globalization and WTO. And in 2019, America refused to participate in the appointment of the judges for the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, without which the WTO will not function, because it is the crown jewel, as it was called, or it is the heart of WTO. If anybody misbehaves in the WTO, the only way to handle that person is to go to the dispute settlement mechanism. But unfortunately, this event was not properly noticed when the COVID event struck, that America has virtually given up globalization, and today there is no functioning dispute settlement mechanism. Even the temporary substitute which they wanted to put was not acceptable to America, Japan, and India, and there is limbo. WTO has virtually come to a grinding halt. The very simple, the very dry, the very crown jewel of globalization is today dysfunctional. So we have to look at this whole thing in the pre-COVID situation. Globalization had become dysfunctional. Of course, the greatest proponent of globalization was The Economist magazine, which has repeatedly written that globalization is dead. So, Foreign Affairs magazine, if you see all these mouthpieces which were promoting globalization as the most durable, almost the permanent model for the world, they have now accepted. This happened before the COVID crisis had hit the world. Now, what has COVID done? COVID is not the cause for the collapse of the post-Cold War world order. Post-Cold War world order has begun gradually and expeditedly shifting already. COVID-19 has only become the context for a sudden shift. What would have been a gradual and expedited shift has become more a sudden shift. It is more COVID-19 is more a context than a cause. Now, what are the casualties of this change? What are the areas where this will strike immediately? The US-China engagement is over. It is dead. This pronouncement came from China Wire, the latest article, beautifully written, as to how it evolved and how its entire basis has collapsed, and how one of the most powerful engagements which drove the world for the last 30 years is now dead. It is so important for the world and for India because an equally matching demography, an equally matching productive strength, potential productive strength is only India. There is no other way the world can try to ignore China, and particularly the Western world has to definitely ignore China because of the total mismatch. The mismatch has come into the open. A non-transparent society will not allow global verification, even in matters of COVID. Now you have to cause an inquiry into how it happened. It's a global demand. And in this US-China engagement, which was the essential drive of the globalization process, has come to a halt. European Union-China relationship couldn't be worse than what it is today, with England taking a decision to do away with 5G and Huawei, and German, of course, through a private party claiming damages, and all kinds of mistrust. You know, globalization can function only if there is a pretension of a trust, at least. There is no actual trust. Even that pretension of trust is over. So now we are, even the WTO is collapsing. The WHO, what it will happen to, we don't know. Multilateralism is a matter of the past today. I don't think anyone is going to agree to extend most favorable nation treatment to everybody. If I am extending it to X, I have to give it to Y. That's over. So generally multilateralism is over, and globalization as a phenomenon, as a model for the world, is now outdated. It was getting outdated, but COVID-19 has made it mandatory, almost mandatory, that the world will never get back to the idea of 1990s. Now the post-COVID-19 world order is most likely to center around, because this is an area of our study, because we are interested in it, we are part of it, it is likely to center around transparent democracies versus non-transparent autocracies. According to me, it is inevitable that the world will have to become increasingly democratic. What is the problem with North Korea? We don't know what's happening inside. And even a partial democracy is better than a walled structure like China. And China is that way the biggest problem of not only the world, but also India, which I will say in some detail as to how I study even the current conflict. Because what is being missed out is what I thought I should mention when we are thinking about what will be the post-COVID world order and India's role in it. We have got to define our position vis-a-vis China, which is become critical for India and for China and for the world. So now look at what India is. Before 1990, India never mattered. In 1990s, India was a pushover. Post-Pokhran, India was seen as an emerging nation because at the time I still remember Bill Clinton made a statement that a country of Buddha and Gandhi has done this great crime of exploding an atom bomb. We were always a country of Buddha and Gandhi. Did you even look at us? Only when the thundering sound of Pokhran was heard, the world began taking note of India. What was China in 1995? It had nothing, it had only poverty, it had hunger, it had deprivation, but it had atom bomb in its hands. The world co-opted China because of atom bomb. The world respects power. India ignored power. When India asserted its power, then India was noticed. Then people began engaging with India, whether it was in the nuclear field or any field. They began engaging with India. We went through the fire test. They put all kinds of sanctions, technology sanctions, financial sanctions, trade sanctions. We overcame all this because ultimately we proved to the world you cannot ignore us. That's where India leapt into another orbit of global relationships. Without Pokhran, India would have been nowhere. But where is the geopolitical, geo-economic analysis in this country? I have not seen much analysis. Now, post 2014, India became global strategic partner. This is another shift. We were never considered a strategic partner of anybody, any important nation. And post COVID-19, India will be an inevitable partner in the global order. This is the gradual improvement, upgradation in the system of Indian participation in the world. So India will be seen rightly by China as replacing China. Not in every sense of the term, but in the importance that China was getting. That importance will gradually and incrementally shift to India, and with China having huge problems. It's not one or two problems. China's problems are many, and they have problem in South China Sea, they have problem in Hong Kong, they have problem with Taiwan. And so with all these problems, and they have of course problem with America, and in the WTO, they are dependent on globalization, but the globalization process itself is in difficulties. So China's problems are multi-dimensional. Some are made by China for itself. I will go into it later as to how the current crisis with India is also because of a situation which needs to be understood in the context of what happened in 2014, about which I have some evidence which I want to share. So China being seen as losing importance and gradually that importance shifting to India, nothing other than democracy, which we saw as the difficulty as compared to how China was enjoying globalization, is the reason for that. Our investment in democracy is one of the biggest investments India had made. But we didn't make the same investment in power. Acquisition of geopolitical power, that is also important. Because of being an inward-looking nation in an aggressive world, we didn't participate enough. And that changed, as I said, with the Pokhran explosion. Now, what is the relative position of China and India in the emerging global order? China will tend to conflict with India because it sees India as the competitor. It was never seeing India as a competitor because it had such a powerful role in the global affairs. It could stop anything in the UN Security Council, which it did not want. The West could do very little. Whether it is Pakistan, whether it is on terror, whether it is on North Korea, in any matter, they have been very confident of stopping the West. The West couldn't do much because China had intruded into other countries with huge investments. You know, in COVID also, when there were problems about image of China in Italy, Chinese and Italians conducted a program that we will stand with China, and there were hundreds and hundreds of Chinese were seen as dancing with Italians to show that we are with them, to re-image China as not an offender in the case of COVID. So their intrusion into other countries through market has been very powerful, and so China that importance if it loses. China's loss is moral importance, ethical importance, and its importance in an importance which you never have got in a liberal world. The unnecessary importance which it got because of its huge economic power which it produced because of autocracy. In fact, I remember reading an article in a liberal paper that none of the labor laws which China followed would have been acceptable in any democracy. That is how they made the workers part of a manufacturing machine, and the union was the government itself. So this kind of thing gave China the lead, and without any moral foundation, and that is now under question. So China will get into conflict with India. But unfortunately, China is not the 1992 Maoist China, which could make Chinese hate India universally. I don't think in China, everybody is going to hate India in the way they hated in 1962. And India in 1962 will not give in to China in the way it had given up in 1962 by a weak leadership. In fact, the famous statement of Jawaharlal Nehru that I have asked my army to drive out the Chinese was the invitation to China, was the reason which rationalized China into invading India, and he spoke this without preparation. See the shift from 1962 to till now. And so there will be China and India conflict because of reasons beyond the control of both. It will not be border. Border will be the context and the cost will be different. Now, I am going to take you to another dimension. China will also tend to conflict with China. And I am citing the 2014 instance when President Jinping came to India, virtually invited himself, that he wanted to come to India as the first head of the state. The new government was sworn to power in June, and Jinping came in September. And when he came, he had come with two ideas. I am saying this because these are completely written in Forbes. The effort was that we should solve the border problem and India and China should have a defense alliance. This was the idea. The visit was September 17th to 19th. After Jinping completes the first leg of the visit in Ahmedabad, on 18th, the PLA invades Ladakh. That becomes the news. And Xi is not in the news. Prime Minister is not in the news. The visit is not in the news. So the next 2 days were spent only to ensure that the Chinese army pulls back. And the entire purpose of the visit, which could have changed the complexion of the game and the relationship between the two countries, which could have made a difference to the world and to China, that collapsed. The evidence is, in fact, the title of the article is "Who Sabotaged Xi Jinping's Indian Visit?" This was the article in Forbes magazine. And when Jinping went there, he first sacked the army generals who caused this catastrophe. And he appointed people of his own choice. So if you see, the People's Liberation Army of China predates the Communist Party, predates the Communist government, and it is more under the Communist Party today than under the government, though in a formal sense, Jinping is the head of all the three, party, government, and the army, PLA. The PLA has still not accepted the reduction in the role that global participation of China has made it accept. And this clash between PLA and the mainline Chinese government where the party will shift. This is going to be a huge issue in China, and the external situation, the external ecosystem will have a bearing on them. So, when we are thinking about a new world order, in which what role India will have, what complications the India and China relationship will produce, and who will be our partners in that, all this will have to be factored into, because this is not going to be limited only to border, it's not going to be limited only to military issues, it's not going to be limited only to regional issues, it is going to become a global issue. And so all this will have to be factored in respect of each. We need the best mind to go into it. Instead of doing many things which JNU is doing, I think they must devote their best mind to look at these issues and not to go for the trivial issues for which JNU is getting known today. That is my appeal to JNU. Now, coming to the changes in the economic model that may come about, the current economic model of the world is entirely a Western social construct. Its historical basis, driven by liberalism and individualism. And that is the foundation of the market. Methodological individualism is the basis of the market hypothesis theory. And that is now proving to be unsustainable because the American families have collapsed, Western families are collapsing. And people are becoming more and more state dependent. 51% of the American families are today state dependent. The universal social security has destroyed the families. Milton Friedman warned in 1982, don't do this. Because if you do it, if you interfere between the moral duties of the next generation to the previous generation by state intervention, the society will collapse. This is what has happened. This is the Western model. And whether it is the social economic model of the West, or the market of Europe, or the market economic model of the Americans, this is the model which is being copied, which is being xeroxed into India through very powerful economic thinking institutions, and the same model, same philosophy, the same structure, the same laws, the same attitudes. Individualism over families, individualism over society. There has to be balance. And that socio-economic order is influencing the world economic model, which is Eurocentric, and it is coming into India. But the Indian economic model is centered on social capital. The social capital is the relationship between people. You cannot create a relationship between people. Today, the entire COVID atmosphere in the country has been managed by relationship. It is the state is working with the society. For example, take how UP has managed the COVID challenge. The chief minister directly related to 44,000 village sarpanchas. Incredible. No such system exists in the West. You have to relate only to the government official then. They know everybody. And so they said, we will not allow anyone who comes from outside and we will quarantine them. You see, a 20 crore population UP is having only 13 to 14,000 COVID infection. And the BMRO states put together, which have a population of 45 crores, have less than 50,000. Whereas the most advanced states, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Delhi and Tamil Nadu, they have almost 80 to 90% of the cases. So, there the society is, and mostly in 6 cities, because there is no social control over the cities. It is the government control. Wherever the society has initiative, we have been able to manage COVID better. Whether it is the family, whether it is the community, whether it is the village, we have been able to do it, but there is no study on this. The socio-economic study of India is the carbon copy of what is happening in the West, looking at people as individuals. No, we are collective. We have a social capital, a natural social capital, And I am happy that the Prime Minister's initiative in the Niti Aayog in the year 2015 on the 1st of January, when the new government took over and passed the resolution to replace the Planning Commission with Niti Aayog, they put two beautiful formulations in that. India has huge social capital. It has to be leveraged for economic development, about which no initiative has been taken because no one has even studied this matter. The second thing is something which works in and for India is needed, and you cannot transplant something from outside into India and make it work. These two things have not been pursued at all. These are the seeds of what the Prime Minister calls today as Atmanirbhar Bharat. Because we have to work on our own structures, our own crutches, our own pillars, our own ideas. And that should be the core. The global will be the additive. But unfortunately, we have reversed it. We have made the global the core and the local the additive. I think that has to change. And institutions like the JNU will have to re-engineer, reformulate itself, and revisit the huge deficits that we have in our thinking. And look at the COVID financing, about which a lot is being talked about, that in the West, huge amounts have been given. We have done nothing. Our budget allocation is so little. Our fiscal contribution is so little. We have only got banks to lend. You know how this debate has gone on with institutions like JNU witnessing it. I am going to give you the bare facts. If you look at the Western countries, the banking assets of G7 countries are $86 trillion. Their market capitalization is $60 trillion. None of these countries have taken even 1 rupee from the bank and 1 rupee from the market. For their entire COVID financing, they have only printed currency. You call it financing? You call it deficit financing? But we borrowed from the banks, from the people's savings. And this borrowing is not from bank. Actually, the sovereign rating of India rests on the unprovided for NPAs of public sector banks being provided on sovereign account. So when the government says you lend it, the government takes the responsibility for that lending, because the private sector banking in the rest of the world, in the G7 countries, is less than 2%. Public sector. Private sector is 98%. Here it is the reverse. But we still have the same discourse, the same number to number comparison. I think something seriously wrong with the Indian mind. So in all these things, we require a very powerful India-centric thinking. And that is where I think institutions like JNU should be more involved in understanding the world in the context of India and India in the context of world, rather than talking about trivialities. We are engaging in trivialities today. We need to be a global level thinking institution and not doing local level smaller things, which is applicable to Delhi. You should think for India, you should think for Asia, you should think for the world. You should think of the world in the context of India and India in the context of the world. I think there is a failure in the Indian discourse which has to be addressed. This is where I look up to the IITs. When I went to the IIT Bombay in 2010 and they asked me to deliver a lecture, and in that lecture when I mentioned what is the social capital of India, which has put up extraordinary performance in 2/3 of the economy in terms of manufacturing and exports, and these are community initiatives, whether it is Ludhiana, Batala, Rajkot, Jamnagar, Morbi, right down to Tuticorin. I went to at least some 40-45 industrial clusters, studied them deeply, 3-4 days, and which is the place with the highest per capita income in India. It is not Delhi, it's not Bombay, it's not Chennai, it's not Bangalore, it's not Hyderabad. It is Morbi in Gujarat. And the one language which they do not know is English. How They were able to produce wealth. Did a JNU study? Did any IIT study? This is the question I asked the IIT people. And they asked me to take a course for them on Indian economic model, which I did for 4 years, in which my appeal to the MBA students was not to go for campus interview, set up their own business. You may be surprised, I heard it because some people came and reported to me. Very little number of people are attending campus interview in the Management Institute of IIT in the last 3-4 years. This is the kind of change we have to bring about in our educational institutions. So my appeal to the JNU is that you raise your vantage point. If you raise your vantage point, as Swami Vivekananda said, if you look at the top of a mountain, the small stones on the way will not disturb you. You have a huge responsibility. So my appeal is that constitute India-centric intellectual work in geopolitics, geoeconomics, economic modeling of India, the social structure of India. What is his good and bad point? We only see bad about India. But how many people know that it is the Ramgarhia community which built the entire industrial base of Punjab? It is only the Patel community which built the entire Rajkot, Jamnagar, Morbi. It is the Gounder community which built 2/3 of the economic power of Tamil Nadu in the western 5 districts. So caste and economics is very productive. Caste and politics is destructive. We have to look at things very systematically, on the ground, how things function. I think what I wanted to communicate to a high-end prime educational institution into which the people of India have invested enormous amount of resources. The land value of JNU will be in several lakhs of crores. It should be occupying this prime property for the world, for India. It should be doing work of that kind. And that is my appeal to you. Thank you very much.
Gurumurthy, thank you very much for this so comprehensive, insightful lecture. I have no doubt in my mind that all the listeners in this webinar have greatly benefited from your inspiring words and very positive way of looking at India and India's role once the pandemic is over. Now, I'm sure there will be many people who would be thinking about asking you a question. I'll request Dr. Anshu and Dr. Saurabh to take down the notes and read out the questions. But before that, let me complement your argument with just a few footnotes. I really admire the way you look at India and India's role. Just a few footnotes. Number one, I am proud of my country because I still remember when I was going to school, I was getting milk powder in the school, and milk powder came from the United States under PL 480. And today I'm proud that India is one of the largest producers of milk in the world. And I know very well that at one time we were dependent on foreign food because we had repeated rounds of drought and famine and all that. And today, on most of the agricultural products and the livestock, according to the Food and Agricultural Organization, India's position is in the top 5 in the world. Now, I'm sure that India has got the best of opportunity. You mentioned about Henry Kissinger and Francis Fukuyama. I had good luck that I interacted with them with multiple times. And it's so good that the same guy who talked about the end of history and the victory of liberalism today is writing about almost potential collapse of the liberal world order. And here is the situation for India to really butt in. I think that today in the entire world, the The trust in the United States and the American system has declined terribly. And the trust in China is almost going to be zero, except the countries which are receiving a lot of money from them. So in the trust deficit between the two most important parts in the world, there is an India which has the duty to actually play a role in the global order. Yet there was a time when India was one of the most poverty-stricken countries in the world. But even at that time, when our military was not very powerful, our economy was not very powerful, India played an important role in global affairs by leading 100 countries in the non-aligned movement as well as in the North-South dialogue. So that gene is there in India as a global player. And right now, I think whatever is happening, I'm sure that your point of view that Indians must think about things in India, rooted in Indian thought, and bring out Indian model. It took an American like Larry Summers to talk about the Mumbai consensus. The whole world, all the economists were talking about Washington consensus, Beijing consensus, and here is Larry Summers who say, no, Mumbai consensus is a solution to the large number of developing countries in the world. So there is a way where you can really play a role. I'm really grateful that your presentation was actually a good combo of a bit of economics, a bit of politics, a bit of sociology, and at the same time strategy. So I really thank you, sir, for this great oration. And now let me request Anshu and Saurabh to come up with and please read it out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I hope I'm audible now. Before we go for the questions and answers round, and I invite Professor Hiraman Tiwari to ask the questions to Guru Murthy ji, I would like to invite Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, for his remarks, if any, on a very comprehensive presentation by Guru Murthy ji. VC sir, if you have any remarks on Guru Murthy ji's session today.
Yes, to unmute here.
Yes, just few seconds only. Guru Murthy ji has very clearly explained the need for transparent democracy and the need for recognizing the value of social capital and the importance of thinking big, keeping India as our central focus. We are really grateful to Shri Guru Murthy ji for delivering this important memorial lecture. There are hundreds of other participants who are watching this lecture, and soon we will also be posting this on our official Facebook page. I'm sure in future the people who watch this lecture will immensely benefit from what Shri Guru Murthy ji has spoken in this today's memorial lecture. On behalf of JNU, I would like to thank him for delivering this important lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. I now invite and request Professor Tiwari to ask the questions, if any, to Guru Murthy ji. I'm sure we have received a lot of questions from the participants. So I request
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think as Honorable the Vice Chancellor and the Rector have spoken about the lecture, the clarity with which he has compacted so many issues, particularly circling around India's role in the world economy. And what I particularly liked about was how can a non-transparent economic power function in a very transparent global economic power, and around which, of course, he produced he gave three models, and the fourth one he largely talked about throughout. And as I am trying to enumerate them: the Marxist economy, socialist economy, free market economy, and the fourth one which he talked about, and he of course valorized and praised, where India is going to make a difference post-COVID in particular, is what he calls democracy with ethical values. And so the incongruous nature of the market economy and non-transparent system is what has led to this 3 odd decades of economic boom, and then suddenly, sadly, it is coming to somehow collapse. Now, what he talked about was, of course, he has worked all his life, Swadeshi model of economy. He mentioned that, can you imagine a chief minister who has 48,000 sub-benches directly connected to them? And that model, because he said carbon copy or rather simply transported the Western model here. And similarly, we have a question almost relating to that. What will happen post-COVID, sir? Will the world, as you are hinting, particularly in India, stop looking to China for economic development, sir? That is I'm giving a summary of 2 or 3 questions which are circling around whether China still remains an attractive economic model for countries to cooperate and follow, sir.
See, actually, China has overplayed its card. See, there is one thing about the Western powers is that they know how to play their cards in a manner acceptable to others. Whenever they didn't do it, they suffered. But they knew how to do it. But China doesn't know how to play cards acceptable to others. For example, it is offering too many friends. And its financial condition, despite having a huge production infrastructure, is not very good because its debt levels are very high. The bank debt to GDP ratio is over 250%, whereas India's is just 50%. So with this kind of unsustainable debt levels and over-dependent on global market, because they have not been able to push their domestic consumption beyond 40%. Your domestic consumption is almost close to 70%. Unless a country has a domestic power, it has domestic savings, it has domestic investments, but it doesn't have domestic savings. A country's economy which is over-dependent on the world should not be behaving in this manner in politics. So I think there is no cohesion in Chinese thinking, because the PLA is thinking in one way, the Communist Party is thinking in one way, the Chinese government is thinking in another way. That is why where I feel the pressure from the world, which will be the counter effect of the pressure that China exerts on the world, will have impact on the domestic issues of China. It's not going to be easy for China to handle itself.
Sir,
I don't think it is going to be an attractive country.
Sir, as you would appreciate at the moment, because of the tension between India and China, many questions that I'm receiving are somehow emanating from that situation which we are facing at the moment. And lots of questions, particularly from the observer, the question is, do you think these skirmishes, this tension with China is going to make a lot of difference on Indian economy, particularly in the context of the voice that is growing in the country of boycotting Chinese products? And sir, one more added question to it. How is it that if there is no cohesion even within the Chinese worldview, that within China, you said the PLA thinks differently, the party thinks differently, of course, the government thinks differently. How did it manage to control the world economy for nearly 2 decades with this inbuilt lack of cohesion, sir?
I will start with the last question. They didn't control the world economy except by controlling China itself. They were very clear that whether it is the party or the PLA or the government, they have to combine to produce an economic strength. This is the greatest contribution of Deng Xiaoping. This was the greatest departure from Maoist China. And fortunately, post Deng, because Deng showed the way to lift China out of poverty, thanks of course to the huge amount of support they received from the Western powers, China understood that they have to do to the world what the West did to the world 50 years ago. So it is a kind of a new colonization, but it required a finesse. That finesse was not there in China. And actually, I'll tell you, just in 2014, when the PLA invaded India on the 18th of September, when Jinping was here in India to conclude treaties that showed that Jinping will not be allowed to be the master. Today, what is happening is also, for PLA, the target is not India only. It is also Jinping. So, just as America is divided openly, China is divided within. And it will be very difficult to detect, as Amartya Sen said, the wall of China is so concealing that if there was a hunger death in Kalahandi, the entire parliament will shut down and food will be transported by air and there will be no death. But 3.37 million people died in China's hunger between 1957 and 60. But the news came out only in 1980s. So this is the extent of lack of transparency that country has. And so that is working against China. Because so long as China was mere a poor country, it was okay. But China is now has produced millions of rich people and thousands of billionaires and millionaires. And so it is not possible for China to continue in the way it is. So it has to express itself by very wrong means. And the several wrong means is it the time to pass the Hong Kong law? Is it the time to down Vietnamese boat? Is it the time to corner with its naval forces the Japanese water for 58 days continuously? Is it the time to start problems with India? So don't think it is a problem between India and China. It's going to be seen as a problem of the world in the context of what China is doing to the other countries. So my feeling is that China's decline is coming about because of lack of policy cohesion in China, because of the most inappropriate policies they are following to get out of the current context in which they have got the worst name any country can have because of COVID.
Our rector, Professor Mahapatra, has asked one question, and he says that because of the COVID and other international political reasons, the supply chain has been disrupted. Do you think it presents an opportunity for a new kind of supply chain in the world, particularly the economies of the world, and India in particular is taking a beating both because of the COVID and other reasons, sir?
You see, my view is the world supply chain today, which is based on the cheapest source of acquisition, is gone. Now people will look for the most comfortable source of acquisition. So the supply chain logistics will change, logic will change, philosophy will change. So the idea that anyone who produces cheapest will conquer the world, that is over. The person who produces must also be a comfortable source. So the redefining of the supply chain formulation is definitely going to help India, and not only India. It is going to restructure the global economy into a very transparent model of seeking comfort rather than seeking profits.
So do you think, there is Professor Sharath Soni is asking a question, since you have hinted towards it, and even in one of your replies, you just said that there is a problem within the Chinese system itself. Do you think that there is some kind of disturbance that is waiting to happen within the country, where Jinping and other rulers will have to remodel, redesign their existence of rule and economy?
You see, it is a very fundamental question, because China, which was a communist China, has now lost its communist character. It has lost its philosophy. It cannot recall Marx. It cannot recall Mao. So it is now recalling Confucius. A communist China is trying to transform itself into a Confucian China without imbibing Confucian values. Just like many in India are using Mahatma Gandhi without Mahatma Gandhi values, because India has many other things to identify itself, but they have nothing to identify itself. They have no philosophy, they have no symbol, and so China is a huge identity crisis. This is one. Number two, Chinese economy, Chinese intellectualism, Chinese academics is so connected to the world today. It is impossible for China to stop importing ideas, which it could do earlier. So, a non-transparent China has transparent people today. So, this is a contradiction. And wealth has added to the problem. Poverty can be tackled by PLA. But prosperity cannot be tackled by PLA kind of oppression. So the problem that is coming is precisely what I pointed out. What happened on the 18th of September 2014, when Jinping was here, PLA sabotaged the whole transformation in the relationship. You imagine we were to sign a defense pact with China. That would have changed. They wanted the same defense pact which China signed with Russia. What would have been the change in the ecosystem? That was sabotaged. So you can understand the deep contradictions, deep conflicts within China. And it is impossible for China to soft land into a democracy. Democracy should be allowed to evolve. We evolved a democracy out of religion, out of caste, out of language, out of all differences, because we had a philosophy. Our philosophy accepted all the differences. That is how we could produce a democracy. You know, in India, democracy was a product of philosophy. We could accept totally divergent things. We could accept a Sita who obeyed her husband, and a Meera who defied her husband. We accepted a Rama who obeyed the father. We accepted a Prahlada who defied the father. We accepted a Lakshmana who obeyed his brother. We accepted Prahlada who defied his brother. So our bandwidth is, we can accept contradictions, total contradictions, hostile contradictions as part of life. This philosophy is what is the source of democracy in India, not votes. That's why we could overcome caste, we could overcome languages. Many people think that's why, because they are used to a universal atmosphere of homogeneity. The diversity of India baffles them, because if you put India on the one side and the rest of the world on the other, you have more diversity here than the rest of the world put together. How will India survive? Will it survive after Nehru? Will it survive after Indira? I mean, these were all the foolish questions which the West was asking. But we had a fundamental understanding of life. So, this is lacking in China. They were basically empire builders. And empire building has no role in the world today. You cannot work with that psychology. The psychology is outdated. You cannot work with an outdated ideology, psychology, structure, thinking in a modern world. So this is the problem of China.
Sir, as an economic philosopher, I think you have beautifully described the ethical and philosophical bandwidth of India, which sustains it even in modern democratic system. Our rector, once again, because he is one of the formidable scholars of international relations, and he's concerned about, he actually giving a theory that globalization and deglobalization are cyclical. Do you think now, after all this, the new kind of globalization, will the globalization come in a different avatar, in a different form, sir?
See, the word globalization is ill-defined, and it was only defined by Francis Fukuyama as the final victory of the West over the rest, in which he knew what the West was, he didn't know what the rest was. he defined the rest as the socialist world. And he defined communism and socialism and statism as the defeated forces. I have no issue, but the world is not exhausted between these two ideas. So the second point is that there will be no conflict in the world. You can never have a world without conflict. You must basically understand human nature is conflicting. You require enlightenment, you require wisdom, you require a philosophy, you require attitudes, you require alliances to handle conflicts. So on both he was wrong, and the globalization was founded on these two principles. Now we have come to accept conflict as a reality, and we have come to accept that market mechanism is not the reality. Certainly, global market mechanism is not the reality. And even the globalized world is actually a triadized world. The trade that takes place between transatlantic countries and the trade that takes place between Asian nations is it exhausts about 80% of the trade. There is nothing like global trade. We unnecessarily coined a name and brought in a global structure which had no meaning and is now getting evaporated. So my feeling is a new order will emerge, and I would like the respected professor to think about it. The world will be divided between transparent democracy and non-transparent autocracies, and the gradual shifting of the autocracies to democracy, otherwise there can be no harmony in the world.
So it's beautiful to listen to you, because Professor Mahapatra, Rector, is watching you at the moment. Maybe he would respond to your asking that he would like to think about, because it was his question and a very critical question at that, sir.
I will complete what I am saying.
Okay, sorry.
I will complete what I am saying, because the world did not have a model by which non-transparent autocracies will gradually transform themselves. For example, Russia was an autocracy. It's gradually shifting to democracy. Many Warsaw Pact countries were autocracies. They are gradually shifting to democracy. We can see some traces of democracy even in the most infertile Arab nations for democracy. Many South Asian nations were not democratic. They are shifting to democracy because they feel this is a more sustainable model, not that it is a better model. I am not voting for democracy in a non-democratic ecosystem, because that is the most practical model. So I believe that this model, which should have come about in 1990s, was thwarted because of incorporating Marxian polity in global market. If it had not happened, even at that time, the West has the finest opportunity to demonstrate that democracy is the most practical model, not the most ideal model. But now the second opportunity has come. What the West failed to do in 1990 in its excitement. Now this new opportunity come. I would like to listen to the professor.
Yes, sorry. So Professor, my rector, Professor Mahapatra, probably he would respond to you. Yeah.
No, I'm not responding. I'll just compliment. Actually, I agree with his analysis. The only points that I would like to say is there is no one type of communism or socialism. There is no one type of democracy. In fact, my guru, Professor M.S. Venkatramani, who spent 35 years of his life studying only America, when he wrote an article in Frontline long time ago, now he's no more, long time ago. The title of the article was 43% Democracy, the United States of America. Because in that country, people don't go to vote. And so there is no perfect democracy. In fact, when the American Constitution was really drafted, it was an elitist document. And they were scared of democracy, thinking that democracy could be mogocracy. Whatever it is, the alternative is worse. But in any case, when I see the big picture at the moment, I think some kind of competition is going on between the authoritarian capitalism of China, totally new, and of course the commercial capitalism championed by the West, That is also not unique and not unified. So many different variants are there. So at the moment, there are quite a few countries that think, they look at China, authoritarian political structure and some kind of market economy, and they have been able to alleviate poverty, and they have been able to manufacture so many thousands of millionaires and billionaires. So here is a model, let's follow. And others who are looking at USA, the Washington Consensus, miserably failed in Latin America and Africa. So there are people in Africa and Arab world who are looking at China as a model, and there are people who are disappointed with the West. But here is India, which is giving a third model of growth in the Indian way of democracy and even the economy, the Mumbai Consensus, where we don't believe in big trust coming into existence and gobbling up everything. There are so many MSMEs in India, 80% of the people employed in the informal sector. And I think Gurumurthy ji knows more about this than I do on this Indian economy thing and all. So at the moment, I look at the future as an opportunity for India to play its due role. It's India's genetic one, due role in the world order, and set it up as a model for a large number of developing countries to follow.
I will only add one sentence. We are not a model. We are recognizing all models. The Indian model is like our positive secularism. It's not that we think all religions are same, but all religions are valid. There is a difference between religion which wants to convert and a religion which doesn't want to convert. There is a difference. Religions have global goals, but we think all religions are valid for their followers. Like that, a model which suits the people of Ghana will not suit another place. Even within India, a model which suits Arunachal Pradesh will not suit Chennai. So we believe in the diversity of models, and that is a philosophy in itself. That is what is going to be the contribution of India. And I think the world post-COVID will also have a huge life change also. This kind of travel, this kind of, too many things are going to change. What will remain and what will not remain, that will decide what will be the emerging global model. Thank you.
So you have beautifully summed up the vision of the Vedic sage who cried out, Ano Bhadraha, Kritavo Yantu Vishwataha. Everything should come together from various sides. Sir, I think my rector wanted to say something. I
was saying the same thing that you're saying. The bottom line is Aham Brahmasmi Tat Tum Asi. That means accept everything. Accept everything. So,
because with a single dimensional mind, you can never understand the multi-dimensional world. So better accept.
Sir, you have placed a big onus on JNU. Thank you for praising this institution. I'm absolutely certain my vice are listening to you very carefully.
It is a conditional praise.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, and sir, I know we can go on listening to you in rapt attention. It's simply beautiful. At least I can speak for many of us. But all good things must come to an end. I will now request my colleague, Dr. Anshu Joshi, to express gratitude to you if she can. I don't know whether she can, but thank you very much for this brilliant, enlightening lecture. Anshu.
Thank you so much, Professor Tiwari, for giving me this wonderful opportunity. However, you are absolutely right. In words, we cannot express our thanks to Shri Gurumurthy ji for his gracious presence today in today's webinar and covering the topic so well. But it is a formality, I have to do that. So Shri Gurumurthy ji, thank you so much on behalf of entire university for your gracious presence in the webinar today and sharing your comprehensive, very relevant and very well thought thoughts with us on post-COVID-19 world order. I would also take this opportunity to thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, for his unconditional support and his presence today. He keeps on inspiring all of us in doing one or the other positive academic things and provides his inspiration and his unconditional support whenever we want. So thank you so much, sir, for that. I would also take this opportunity to extend our Thanks to our Honorable Pro Vice Chancellor, Sir, Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, for chairing today's session and sharing his remarks, which are very relevant and related to not only the topic, but whatever Guru Murthy ji said. Last but not the least, I would like to thank Professor Tiwari for making this question and answer session so
The
interesting.
audience.
And I would also like to thank all participants for gracing today's webinar with their presence. I'm sure that they would attend tomorrow morning's gala program on International Yoga Day also, organized by JNU, and they would keep watching
Online.
and subscribing.
Yes.
Yes, they would keep watching and subscribing our official Facebook page of JNU. So last but not the least, I would also like to request, please stay safe, take care of yourself. And on that note, would like to end today's program. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Namaskar.
so much. And
Namaskar.
Thank you.
it was,
Thank
yeah,
you
thank
all.
you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.